take a look. Hi everybody, welcome to Dulcimerica. My name is Bing Futch. Thank you very much for joining me. We're going to go back into the realm of the jam. Last week we looked at a beginner level approach to playing in the jam. This week will be an intermediate level approach, digging a little bit deeper. Just a recap for beginners, as you're in the jam, there are three very important things you should be thinking about. One is to know the key of the song or tune that you're playing. Two is to know what scale is associated with that key. And three, know what chords are possible within that key as well. Now, as we found out last week, most of the jam tunes you run across aren't really sophisticated in that they use all of these different chords and very complicated melodies and chord substitutions and stuff. In fact, you can boil it down to 3 chords and a subject, and that's pretty much it. So understanding what sort of chords you might be running into is a good idea, and as we found out last week, the most popular chords in the jam are chords built off of the 1st, 4th, 5th, and sometimes 6th scale degree, also known as the 1-4-5 chord progression. And that one minor chord that always seems to crop up usually is, not always, the 6th scale degree, or the minor 6. So we looked at the key of D major largely, and so the 1-4-5 chords in D major are D, G, and A. And then the 6th chord is a B minor. And those are 4 chords that are good to know. And we showed you all the different ways you can play those 4 chords all up and down the fretboard while you're also looking for melody. We also talked about the D major scale. Now let's take a look also at the 1-4-5 and 6 chords for the other 2 keys that we play a lot in, key of G and key of A. In the key of G we have 1 sharp, that's F sharp, and our 1-4-5 chords are G, C, and D. Our 6th chord is E minor. And of course we use the G major scale to pick our melody and also to build our chords. Then we're going to take a look at the key of A. That's 3 sharps, F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. And our 1-4-5 chords here are A, D, and E. Then we have our 6th chord, that's going to be F sharp minor. And of course we're using the A major scale to build all of our chords, and of course that is our scale to use with the melody as well. So knowing those 3 things are going to give you a lot of power in the jam, of course, but there's so much more that we can do and add on to that, and that's what we're going to do this week, starting off with detecting when these chords are changing. Yes, 1-4-5 are very popular chords, 6 is a very popular chord, but some jam chords, or some jam songs rather, really go above and beyond that. They throw other chords in there, and yes, there are even substitution in borrowed chords, which means these are chords that aren't a part of the key. So how can you find them? The best way really is by listening to them and training your ear to hear intervals. What are intervals? Intervals are the distances between notes. They can be the distances between 2 notes on a fretboard. That's a minor 6 right there. Or they can be actually intervals within the chord. So if you're playing a chord with 3 notes, each one of those notes has a relationship to the other by way of how far apart they are on the scale in the spectrum. So it's really important to train your ear to be able to hear these distances, because they can help you and will help you in the jam to hear how the chords are changing. And here's one trick I want to show you now involving the 1-4-5 chords. Let's do this in the key of D major to start off with. So we have D, G, and A are our 1-4-5 chords. Here's D, that's our 1 chord. 4 chord G, 5 chord A, and then back to our 1 chord D. So let's say you're in a jam, you've got about 25 people, 30 people all in a big circle, all different types of instruments, and people are starting to play the tune. How do you know when the chord is changing? Well, first of all, if you know the key, let's say we're in D major, And you know what those 1, 4, 5 chords are. Typically we're starting off with the 1 chord, D major. So everyone's starting to play D. As long as it sounds like that, we know that the chord hasn't changed, right? So you can do everything with D. Play your D major scale, play in your D zone. Remember where that is, right here, open through the 3rd fret. But then all of a sudden you hear that the chord does change. So how do you know what chord it's changing to? Here's what I do, and maybe it'll help you too. I like to listen for the lowest pitched note that is audible in the room. So if I was playing, come on, listen for the lowest note. There's the lowest pitched note right there. Most of the time, the lowest pitched note will be the root of the chord. Remember that we can build triads using a root as the lowest pitched note, a 3rd, which is the middle pitched note, and then a 5th on top, which is the highest pitched note. If you look for that lowest pitched note, that is often the name of the chord. So if that lowest note is D, and we're listening to a happy chord, not a sad chord, then that's going to be a D major chord. It's that simple, really. So when we hear that chord change and we are no longer hearing this low D, the next thing we're going to be listening for is what note are we actually moving to. So if we're moving to a G chord, the 4 chord, I'm going to be listening for that lowest pitched note. Bum, 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 bum. And so I know I'm playing G right now. But if I'm in the jam and I'm not sure what the difference is between them, let me give you some pointers on how to find that out. Let's listen to the lowest pitched note in D major again, D. And let's listen to the lowest pitched note in G major, which is G. Now listen to these 2 notes back and forth. Okay, so there's our 1, and there is our 4. Now, I'm going to play it with a particular sort of rhythm and see if this reminds you of anything. Does that sound like a tune you might know? If you said, "Here Comes the Bride," you are correct. That is a great little musical mnemonic that you can store in your head to remind you that the distance between D and G is a 4th, an interval of a 4th. The distance between D and G is a perfect 4th. Why it's perfect, that's for another workshop. But for right now, that is a 4th, which means that we're moving from our 1 chord to our 4 chord. So if you hear the lowest pitched note in the chord, the first chord we play, our 1 chord, and then you hear that lowest pitched note move up a 4th, then that means that the chord we're playing is now going to be the 4 chord. Now let's go on back to the 1 chord, and let's play our 5 chord, A major. Listening for the lowest pitched note. Bum, 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 bum. That's the A of our 5 chord. Now let's play our 1 chord lowest note. Bum, bum, bum. And now play our 5 chord lowest note. Bum, 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 bum. Go back and forth a little bit. Bum, 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 bum. So let's find a musical mnemonic that's going to be able to trigger when we hear that movement between the 1 chord and the 5 chord. The one I like to use is A, B, C, D, ba, ba, black sheep, twinkle, twinkle. Or Flying Monkeys from The Wizard of Oz. Yo-wee-yo, yo-wom. When you hear that interval from the 1 to the 5, that is going to be your 5 chord, the interval of a 5th, or the perfect 5th. Again, another time we'll talk about why they are perfect. So we have 1 D chord going to 4 chord. Bum, bum, ba, bum. Here Comes the Bride from 1 to 4. We have 1 going to the 5 chord. Ba, ba, black sheep, twinkle, twinkle. A, B, C, D. That is the 1 chord going to the 5 chord. Now, that's pretty easy to figure out, but we're talking about a pretty wide open interval, at least 4 notes and then 5 notes, going from the 1 and then coming up. You all know that we're going to sometimes go from the 4 chord to the 5 chord. Well, you can tell right off the bat that that's a very, very small move when you first hear it. Here's our 4 chord, then to our 5 chord, back to our 4 chord, back to our 5 chord. So it's not a very big move from the 4 lowest note to the 5 lowest note. In fact, that's a major second interval. It's just 1 step up. So as you're bouncing around the 1, 4, 5, you're going to hear these intervals, and you can tell when the chord is going to change and what it's changed to. So what if we're playing a type of chord where the bass note isn't really pronounced? For example, we can play a 0, 1, 3 chord. It'll still be a 4 chord, but the bass note is now playing D instead of playing G. Bum, bum, bum. But our root note is G. Bum, bum, bum. So what do you do in that circumstance? Well, hopefully enough times hearing these songs over and over again, you'll be able to really tell when we're starting off with the 1. Obviously, we're not playing the 1 chord, so we're going to the 4 chord. If we're playing a D as the lowest note, well, no, the chord changed. That can't be D. It's just the way that the mountain dulcimer is set up, basically. So after a while, you'll develop sort of a sixth sense about it and say, you know what, this is a 4 chord, not a D chord, just because it has that D as the lowest note. You can hear other elements, though, lifting that chord up. From 1, bum, 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 bum. In that case, we're looking at the interval between the major third of the 1 chord, interval major third going to the next note up, which is the 4 chord. So 3 and 4 are next to each other. We're getting into some math, but you can always find a way to name the chord just based on listening, and of course based on your mnemonic recall, whatever that might be for you. After a number of times of hearing these motions, you're going to be able to tell automatically not only when the chord is what the chord is changing to, but when the chord is going to change. Sometimes you start guessing about these things because songwriters have used this sort of format for a very, very long time. We're going to walk up to the G, back to the 1, then we go to 5, and then we go to 1, then we go to 4, back to 1, then to 5 real quick, back to 1. So many songs have used that. After a while, you'll find yourself starting to make those chord changes even before they happen. It just takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of active listening to understand what is happening in the jam. Now, let me show you something really fun here. And actually, before I do that, let's take a look at our 6th chord. That 6th chord is minor, so obviously, if we're playing, and then you hear, ooh, sad, serious chord, that is probably going to be your minor 6, but not always. It's going to be the one that really sounds the best, like it belongs. If you find yourself listening for and hearing the other 2 minors in the key of D, E minor and F sharp minor, F sharp minor would probably be the next bet because it's what we call a mediant chord. It's 3 steps away from the root. And that's a very, very popular one to bring in. It's also a very heartbreaking chord, the F sharp minor, or the minor 3 chord is what we're looking for. The other version is going to be E. E is going to be built off the second scale degree, and it is going to show up usually as part of a very roundabout turnaround when we start bouncing between all of the different chords in a particular key. E minor usually ends up being there after we have bounced around a little bit, kind of like this. And then that E minor comes in, and it kind of sounds good going to B minor. So once again, you can listen here for the lowest pitched note. In the case of B minor, it's going to be a little bit weird because the lowest pitched note that we're playing, that I'm playing right now, is actually F sharp. The root of the chord, B, is here on the middle string, so it's one of those, it's a middle note basically. So when it comes to the minor chords and the way we're playing them, it might be easier to play some L-shaped chords, B minor 5, 5, 7, to get used to hearing that sound as well. Bum, 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 bum. Let's do that from D. Bum, bum, bum. Bum, 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 bum. That's an interval of a major 6. It's the first two parts of the NBC jingle. NBC. There's a mnemonic for every one of these intervals, and the more you study your intervals, the more you'll be able to hear the changes, not only amongst the 1, 4, 5, and 6 chords, but also amongst the remaining chords as well. You'll not only be able to recognize them not only by their roots, but also by their character and how they're used, how we get to them, how we move on from them to go on to the next chord. There definitely is a science involved with that, and again, the more you listen and the more you think about it, the more you'll be able to recognize when these things actually happen. Now I'm going to show you something really cool. We did all that in the key of D. Do these rules apply in other keys as well? They certainly do. I'm going to use the capo now to get us into some different keys. We don't need it, of course, to play in the key of D major, and we really don't need it to play in the keys of G or A, but if you want to not have to close your chords and play with your fingers on all the strings, if you want to have that drone do some of the work so you can just simply play melody, then the capo is the way to go. Let's go ahead and get into the key of G by capoing at the 3rd fret. This goes along the lines as what we talked about last week with our zones. We had our D zone open through the 3rd fret. We had our G zone, 3rd fret through the 6th fret. We had our A zone going from the 4th fret to the 7th fret, not using the 6th fret because we want to have sharps in our scale. This is kind of the same thing, only the capo is going to dictate where the end point or the start point of our zone is. So let me get this so it's not buzzing. There we go. And it buzzes anyway. I knew I should have grabbed my other capo. There we go. All right, good enough. So here's our zone, 3 through 6. Our G major scale's right there in the middle. Notice how everything inside that box sounds good with the G drone. Same thing with our A zone. We can go ahead and move the capo up here to the 4th fret. Not using the 6th fret now. And the A major scale is here. All of these notes in the A zone are going to work just fine with the A drone. And all of our chords for that are right inside of that zone as well. Now what's really cool is that the thing I showed you with the musical mnemonics earlier about listening for the lowest pitch note, they still work here to show us what our 1, 4, and 5 are going to be. So let's start off with our 1. Bum, 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 there's our lowest note. Okay, Okay, so we're moving along. We're looking for our 4 chord, right? Bum, 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 bum. Bum, bum, bum. Here comes the bride. Here comes the bride. So that's our 4 chord. So the interval is going to sound the same. We're playing completely different chords, but the interval is going to be the same. Doesn't matter what the key is. A perfect 4th interval is always going to have Here Comes the Bride as its musical mnemonic. Let's find our 5 chord now. Bum, bum, bum. Gonna go bum, bum, bum. A couple of ways I can do this, but let me do it this way. Bum, 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 bum. Let me do that another way now. Bum, 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 yo-wee-yo, A, B, C, D, ba-ba, black sheep, twinkle, twinkle. So once again, there's our perfect 5th interval, and we're just listening for the lowest note. Same way, it sounds the exact same way as it did in the key of D, but the chord itself and the notes involved with the chord are different. But you still get the same musical mnemonic because we're still doing an interval of a 5th from the root. So no matter what the key is, if you use those 2 very, very special mnemonics, you'll be able to tell what chord things are turning to. Now, if we're dealing with one of the other chords, again, it'll just take some careful listening and some thought to understand now where that chord is moving. Let me show you one more thing that's really cool here about deciphering what it looks like to play your 1, 4, 5 chords. We've covered this before on Dulcimerica. Very, very simple way of playing the 1, 4, 5 would be to go 0, 0, 2. So look at the nut right here. The nut is very important, and we're going to judge everything and measure everything in relationship to the nut. So first I'm going to start off by playing the 1 chord. Pretend I don't have the 1.5 fret for a second here. So I'm 2 frets up from the nut, and I'm just going to play this to get our 0, 0, 2. There's my 1 chord. In relationship to the nut, I'm 2 frets up. Let's remember that. Now I'm going to play a 3, 1, 0, 4 chord for G major. Okay, in relationship to the nut, I am right next to the nut on the middle string, just 1 up, 3 frets up from the nut on the bass string for my shape here. I'm going to take a picture of that with my mind, and that's our 4 chord shape. And then I'm going to do a simple 101 chord for our 5 chord A. Nothing on the middle, and bass and melody are right next to the nut. Okay, now remember that our 1 chord is this, 2 up from the nut on the melody string. 4 chord is this, 1 up from the nut middle, 3 up from the nut on the bass string. 101, our 5 chord, nothing on the middle, and 1 up from the nut on the bass and on the melody string. Now, this is where it gets fun. Let's say the banjo player comes in, wants to do a G tune. You're not sure what the chords are in the key of G. But it doesn't matter, because not only do you have musical mnemonics to help you decipher when the chord is changing and to what chord it's changing, we also have now our sight lines. Now this is the nut. The nut used to terminate here, but now we have actually shortened the scale length using this capo, and that is the new nut. A capo is nothing but a movable nut. So, in relationship to the nut, where do we want to go for our 1 chord? 2 frets up on the melody string. There's our 1 chord, which happens to be G major. Now we're going to go to our 4 chord. Remember, 1 up on the middle string from the nut, 3 up from the nut on the bass string. That gives us our 4 chord. That happens to be C major. And then our 101 shape is going to be here for our 5 chord, 1 up from the nut on the bass and melody string. And it works out. That's our 5 chord, and that happens to be D. Right? Now, the fiddle player comes in and wants to do an A tune. We're going to do the exact same thing. Okay, 2 up from the nut. And remember, we're not using the 6th fret, so don't count that. 2 up from the nut, our 1 chord. 1 up from the nut on the middle, 3 up on the bass. Our 4 chord. And our 101 shape, 1 up on the nut on bass and melody string for 5 chord. And everything works out. So there we have A, D, E, back to 1. So even if you don't know the chords, you can use a visual pattern to find out what our 1, 4, 5 chords are. And then finally, bring it on back home. And the same thing goes for any of the chord shapes, anywhere that we're playing there, or even melody lines. So we can do our B minor 6 chord, and that is going to be the exact same position if we get up here to our 3rd fret for G. There's our E minor, the minor 6 for G, and then we've got F sharp minor, the minor 6 for key of A. That's a very, very quick way of being able to get into playing all of the very popular chords when we're playing in the jam. And the capo is your friend when it comes to doing that sort of thing, getting immediately into the key of G, the key of A, and for those times we're playing in the key of E minor, you want to put that capo at the 1st fret, and that's going to give you a nice E minor-y drone to play along with tunes like Going to Boston and Shady Grove and Cold Frosty Morning. It's helpful because you don't have to play the chords. You can have the drone put you in the basic right mood, and then you'll also have the scale set for you on the other strings, so you can play along and find the melody if you don't want to try and boggle your head with everything else that's going on there. So that's a really, really cool way of trying to get an idea of where we're at on the fretboard, knowing when those chords are changing and knowing how to deal with them. But you don't need the capo. You can just bar using your fingers to get into G and into A. And one more thing I want to show you here real quick before we move on is, let's go back to our 4th fret. Talked about playing in the key of A. This is not going to come up a whole bunch, but I like to point it out to you. Key of A, remember, we're not going to use the 6th fret because we've got F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp at 3 sharps in the key of A. And we've got all of our sharps for this right here in the key of A. We've got G sharp in the middle, C sharp on the bass and melody, and an F sharp on the 5th fret middle string. Everything you need right there for the key of A. Sometimes somebody will say, let's do something in A minor. And when that happens, you're still going to capo at the 4th fret, but now we're not going to use the 6.5 fret, we're going to use the 6th fret instead. We are taking C sharp down to C natural, and we're taking G sharp down to G natural. So if you don't use this fret, you're going to be able to do, and what I would also recommend at this point is not to play the F sharp on the middle string, because that's going to clash, because we want to be in the key of A minor, and there is no F sharp in A minor, it's F natural. So we're going to be playing the 6th fret and ignoring the middle string at the 5th fret in order to play in the key of A minor. What if you need that F? Well, the only thing you can do is, if you've got the 8.5 fret, you can play F right here. So it's handy to know what notes you have available on your fretboard, and it is handy to have a couple of extra frets around just in case you want to mess around with that. So that's looking at playing with the capo. So let's say the tune is banging along and you're having a great time capoing in and not capoing, and you can hear those chords moving and you're finding the melody because you're looking for them in those zones. What else can you do? What other fun things can you do when you're in the jam? Well, you can make it an arrangement on the fly by using something that many people call chops. Chops are after beats, and because they're syncopated, meaning they're on the weak beats as opposed to the strong beats, these syncopations can help drive a piece of music. You've heard chops before. You got a bluegrass band and someone's playing the lead part and there's chords going on, but there's also a different type of chord that's going cha 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 like this. So let's take that and apply it to Boil Them Cabbage Down. No, let's use Black Mountain Rag. So Black Mountain Rag. Do 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 That's fun, isn't it? Oompa, 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 oompa. That's what that is. After beats, they're called chops by many, many people. So you can do that if you don't feel like messing around with melody. If you just want to add a little something to the jam and give back, chops sound great when you get 1, 2, 3, or 4 more dulcimer players doing it because the jam begins to start to sound like an actual arrangement, like an orchestra, everybody playing some different parts. Here's my secret for playing chops. First of all, chops, if you imagine we're playing on a 4/4 measure, 4 beats in the measure, and the downbeat is 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, chop on 2 and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're really good at counting, you can simply go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. But it's helpful to have a meter with which to play, which is why I am going 4 quarter notes, and my fingers are playing all closed chords. Closed chords are where your fingers are on every single string. So I've got my fingers on the strings, they're not pushing down on the fretboard, so when I strum across the strings, I'm just getting a noise, right? So I'm getting noise on 1 and 3, and on 2 and 4, I'm pushing my fingers down to the fretboard to get tone, and then lifting them up to cut them short. And what I end up with is this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So not only do you have those chops and you don't have to worry about feeling weird about bringing them in on the afterbeats, but you also have this sort of percussive thwack going on, and now you're adding a little bit of drums and percussion to the mix, and that really sounds good in the jam as well. You can improvise and add a few more extra strums to that as well. So when I go down to G, instead of playing a 3-1-0, see, I'm not touching the melody string, and because of that, it's droning on. When I lift my fingers up off of the fretboard, keep them on the strings, they're muted, but the droning is still happening. So I like to play a 3-1-0 as a 3-1-3. I double the G, so that way when I lift up my fingers off of the fretboard, everything will stop. Likewise, when playing an A major chord, if you play a 1-on-1, that middle string is going to drone. So I like to either play a 1-2-4 chord, or in the case of Black Mountain Rag, a 3-2-1 chord, because that basically is an A7 chord, and it sounds really good with Black Mountain Rag, and it actually is a closed chord, so I don't have to worry about doubling notes or anything like that. So that's a really cool thing to do, is to have those chops in there because you're providing percussion as well as a really nice propulsive rhythmic figure that comes along. Chops are a lot of fun. And there's one more thing I want to show you here, and that is playing harmony and counter melody. So you can't target the melody. but you can target something that's kind of close to the melody that will be complementary, and also, again, an arrangement sounding so that the jam isn't just everybody playing in unison, but there are different parts taking place at different times and, of course, at different pitches. So let me give you an example of what that's like, because you can be a lot more, you can be less specific and less accurate about what you play as long as it's generally pleasing to the ear. So here's our melody again for Black Mountain Rag. Okay, now some of these you'll be able to pick up the melody very, very quickly, but other times you'll be stumped. And so at that point, you might still be able to hear what the melody is doing, but for fear of not being right on top of the note and being just to the left or just to the right, which can generate some dissonance, which other people might consider a mistake or what the heck are they doing, you can stay clear of that and take your note a little further away from the source and go for some harmonies. 3 notes, 4 notes away, it's going to sound a lot more consonant than if you were trying to dial it in right on the money. And you can find a nice, comfortable place where you can maybe sit and strum on that note for a while to see when it harmonizes, when it stops harmonizing, and then move someplace else. So I'm going to hum Black Mountain Rag, and I'm going to play what sometimes I'll do as a harmony or as a counter melody. Let's see if I can make this happen now. Bum 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 ba-dum 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 bum bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-da-da-da-dum bum dum da-dum bum 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 ba-da-dum bum 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 ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum 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 bum. That's one example of not playing the melody, but playing alongside the melody and providing harmony, or whatever you want to, holding on to a note for a while. The nice thing about doing that is, you know, if you care about these things, if someone hears you playing, they know you're not even trying for the melody. They know you're just trying to add something to the piece. And as I mentioned last week, this is a great opportunity with all of these different people playing and providing a sonic canvas upon which you can experiment. This is a great time to see what works and see what doesn't, because for the most part, no one can actually hear what you're doing except for you. So it's a great time to use the jam as a learning experience and just kind of bolster up the things that you can do when you are in the jam. So I hope that is helpful. We're going to put all of this stuff together next week for our advanced level study. I'll get a looper pedal in here. We're going to play Black Mountain Rag, stack it a couple of times to make it sound like a group of people playing, and then we're going to employ a lot of the stuff I've talked about last week, this week, and add a few more things as well. If you want to go on to a deep dive with even more of this, come check me on Patreon at patreon.com/Bing Futch. I've got so much stuff there, 30 years of my archives, including books, CDs, videos, tablature, and weekly exclusive content for just $5 a month or $50.40 for the annual pass, which is a 16% discount and gets you 2 months free. You'll love it. Come on over and check it out if you're a mountain dulcimer, ukulele, Native American flute player, or studying general music theory. Patreon.com/Bing Futch. Scroll down, look at the featured tags section. The open house is where you want to go. Over 500 posts of free stuff to download. And if you like it, come on and join me at Patreon, where we can all get together in the amazing jam that is the everyday. Music is a healing balm, absolutely. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next week.